Hello and welcome back to Eye on Iowa. I'm Sarah Mueller, a reporter with Forbes, and today I am joined by Professor Tim Hagle with the University of Iowa. We have a lot to break down because in the last about 2 weeks, there's been a couple of dropouts from this race. We have Mike Pence most recently, we have Larry Elder, we have Perry Johnson, and earlier this summer, the mayor of Miami also dropped out. So Francis Suarez. So I want to get your kind of your temperature on what's going on right now. Now that we had a really dense race and it's kind of getting whittled down.
Let me also add to that list, Will Hurd dropped out in early October as well. But for some of these folks like Suarez and Hurd and Johnson, they weren't polling in even above 1%. They were below the 1% line. So their dropping out really didn't make too much of a difference. But what we're starting to see now that we've entered the fall season, deep into it now that we're a day away from November 1st as we talk here, that you're starting to see some of these candidates drop out. And they had their shot. They came to Iowa and other states and tried to get some momentum, some name recognition. And for some of them, it just wasn't going to work. And that's understandable for some of the candidates that we really didn't expect somebody like a Will Hurd or Suarez from Miami or some of the other folks, that they were just sort of a really, really long shot. And it was more a matter, I think, of maybe testing the waters, seeing sort of what it's like, getting some familiarity with the process for them to run in other campaigns, not even necessarily presidential campaigns, or to make a particular point. That was Will Hurd's thing, as he was just definitely an anti-Trump guy. So now we're getting down to the folks that maybe make more of a difference. There's still a few candidates that probably shouldn't be in the race. Asa Hutchinson is one. He's just not doing very well and may not make the stage for the third debate. Uh, Doug Burgum has got the money to continue, but he's really not doing that much either. So there are some candidates that we would expect to drop out still within November. There are other candidates that maybe will hang on until the very end, even though it doesn't look like they would have much of a shot. And that's sort of where we're at right now, is you're starting to see calls to consolidate the not Trump votes, because Trump is still doing very well, even here in Iowa, though not as well as he is in some other places in the national polls. But at 43% from the recent Iowa poll that was released yesterday, that's a pretty big margin ahead of the second place folks, which was a tie between DeSantis and Haley. And so what people are saying is that, well, you need to consolidate. And how are you going to do that? Well, I would say to some extent that pretty much everybody other than DeSantis and Haley should probably drop out, because they're not going to have any kind of a shot. And that includes folks like Chirste, who's not really campaigning in Iowa, but he is campaigning in New Hampshire. And so that's where he's sort of put his emphasis, but he's not doing all that well there either. And so if everybody dropped out, you'd still have that not Trump vote split between two people, DeSantis and Haley. And if it's evenly split, then Trump still wins. So, unless you had a situation where you were down to just one candidate, and Haley's campaign is making the argument that she should be the one candidate. Of course, DeSantis's campaign is probably going to make the same argument. And they both really kind of have a shot of being that not Trump person, and for different reasons. But again, if you do split the vote in some ways, that if the polls are accurate, and I would put a big if on that too. Always take polls with a grain of salt, even the Iowa poll, that it looks like Trump's headed to victory unless things change drastically.
Now, there's been a lot going on in the GOP camp because obviously we saw the Speaker of the House debacle over the last few weeks. What is the importance of the GOP unifying? Because it seems like they're really all over the place, not just in the presidential race, but also in obviously the House.
Yeah, the thing about the House race is, of course, you've got such a narrow margin, and you're always going to have some people that, for one reason or another, don't want to go along with the consensus or the group sort of thinking on this. Some people will go along because they understand how the House or how the chamber works, and sometimes this is true in the Senate as well, that sometimes you have to make compromises, and that's always one of the things that hurts members of the Senate when they run for the presidency, is that they have had to often compromise, and that often irritates the base, that they don't understand how sometimes you have to go along to get along. So in the House, because you have so many more members, for over 4 times more than in the Senate, that you have even a larger number of people that are maybe, more idiosyncratic or more driven by their personality or whatever it happens to be, or the particular situation. And that's sort of what precipitated the problems that Republicans had over the speaker race, where a couple of people were unhappy with McCarthy and said, all right, we're going to pull the trigger on this, because they had set up a situation where one member would trigger a vote. And of course, that caused the chaos that ensued for the next couple of weeks. Although chaos may be a little bit too strong a word, it certainly made the Republicans look bad, and certainly Democrats wanted to help the Republicans look bad, and they did so. So, as it turns out, not much happened. People are probably going to forget about that. It's interesting that we, have a new speaker, a little bit younger, a little less known. And so we'll see what he's able to accomplish, but he faces the same problems that McCarthy did. But more generally, in terms of the argument that the Republicans seem to be in a bit of chaos, again, that's always kind of true. Republicans sometimes don't do a good job in terms of leading. That's often they're a little bit better at being the minority party. We saw this, for those of us that are old enough, we saw this in particular in 1994, when after some 40 years of being in the minority, Republicans all of a sudden were in the majority in both chambers. And it's like, oh, what do we do now? Which sort of reminds me, again, for people that are older and watch movies, of the Robert Redford movie, The Candidate, where after he wins the election, it's like, well, now what do I do, kind of a thing. Who's expecting this? The dog that catches the car, that kind of a thing. So Republicans are sometimes in that kind of position, and as a result, things look bad. But the hope is, from the Republican point of view, that by the time of the election, they've got about a year to go, that they can get their act together. And that's going to be the key, regardless of who the presidential nominee is, that Republicans are going to look very hard to find ways to consolidate their victories, to maintain control of the House and expand it, so that you don't have a couple of people that can hold up everything, and also regain control of the Senate. Of course, Democrats are looking to do the opposite.
Obviously, we've had these couple drop out, and a couple of them have endorsed other candidates such as Donald Trump, Perry Johnson, and Larry Elder, who I'm speaking with later today. Does this benefit the Trump camp, or is this, okay, it's a drop in the bucket?
It depends a little bit on who it is that's dropping out and who's doing the endorsing. So you mentioned Johnson and Elder both endorsed Trump. Will Hurd endorsed Nikki Haley. So no surprises there. Certainly Hurd wasn't going to endorse Trump, since that's who he's running against or to defeat. For somebody like Johnson and Hurd in particular, it's not going to make much. They weren't polling very high. They didn't have much of a base that they could say, okay, go base, go my base, go support this other candidate. But it does free up a number of people. And even though they're small, a percent here, percent there, especially given with the not Trump folks, that they're all kind of clustered together, even DeSantis and Haley, which are a little bit ahead, are now seemingly tied, at least in the Iowa poll, that it can make a little bit of a difference, at least in those terms. And that can be important in terms of making a case that you've got some momentum in a particular state or just nationally, and that will help them maybe sway donors to continue to contribute to your campaign. For some people, like maybe Larry Elder, he's got more of a name recognition because of his media work, that he might be able to swing a few more people than is otherwise the case towards whoever it is that they happen to endorse for one reason or another. But for the most part, if a candidate that endorses, if it's that's all they do is say, oh, I endorse this person, and don't do anything else, it's not usually going to make much of a difference, especially here in Iowa, because for a lot of the caucus goers, or people are intending to go to the caucus, that they are still weighing several people. They may have one that they'll tell a pollster, yeah, this is who I would vote for today, but that can change. And if that person drops out, then they're sort of a free agent at that point, and they can go ahead and look at the other candidates that they're looking at. One of the things that the Iowa poll took a look at was, well, who's your second choice? Or are you locked into a particular candidate? And those two questions are important to show, well, how solid is your support in a particular place? For Trump, the support is pretty solid. A good chunk of his supporters, people have not said that he'd be their first choice. Their mind is made up, that they're not looking for anybody else, and they don't expect Trump to drop out. Whereas with the other candidates, especially the ones beyond Haley and DeSantis, there's a potential where that candidate's going to drop out. And if so, they're going to be looking for, who's my second choice here? And so they're probably already thinking along those lines.
Now, another name I'm going to throw out, which I feel like we don't hear about a lot since, even the debates, is Senator Tim Scott. We got reports in the last couple of weeks that he is moving around some of his initiatives to go more towards Iowa than New Hampshire. Some of his resources he's going to bring over into Iowa. Do you think that this is going to benefit him given where he's at in the polls?
The thing about Scott is that he seemed to have a moment earlier on, and especially here in Iowa, that his faith-based approach seemed to resonate with the evangelicals that are among the Republican voters and caucus goers. But he also seems to have faded a bit. He didn't do all that well in the first debate, and the second wasn't much better, a little bit. And also, we learned that the PAC supporting him has pulled their ad buy for the fall. I'm not sure if they're going to put it up again later in December or January, running crunch time, or what. Now, they've said they're going to continue their ground game, still do door knocking and phone calling, maybe some still sending out mailers. We'll have to see. But for the most part, that doesn't look good. That even if you're continuing the ground game, but you're pulling all those resources, while at the same time supposedly increasing your presence in Iowa, it seems kind of a mixed message. And I think that for one reason or another, as I said, Scott sort of had his moment and he started to fade a little bit. And I think even has gotten behind Ramaswamy in Iowa at this point. Now, that's not what the Iowa poll indicated. It did indicate that, Scott had fallen back a couple of percentage points. Again, all this is within the margin of error. But still ahead of Ramaswamy. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case because, like I say, Scott has been fading. Ramaswamy had his moment, although he's sort of stalled too, partly because of his lack of foreign policy experience. That once Hamas attacked Israel, that foreign policy became a front and center issue, particularly given some of the things that are happening in the United States with regard to protests of various sorts and what that means and what it means for the United States in terms of what's going on with Hezbollah and whether we're going to get involved. And Ramaswamy just doesn't seem to have the foreign policy expertise, and certainly much less so than somebody like Nikki Haley, who he sparred with in the past. So as far as Scott is concerned, that he's kind of been left out of the conversation in large measure.
Yeah, and I just want to know all of these different camps, all these different groups of people. How is this going to impact Donald Trump's campaign?
Well, so far, it hasn't seemed to have had much effect at all on the campaign. That is sort of interesting is that even though Trump didn't get indicted in the last month or so, he has had his civil fraud trial in New York begin. And he had the opportunity before going into the courtroom each day or the days that he showed up there to give extended comments, complaining about the judge and the prosecutor and so forth. And it didn't seem to have much of an effect on his poll numbers, that he's basically been stalled at those sort of mid to low 40% range here in Iowa for quite some time. So all of the things that are going, the other candidates, the debates, and external events and all of that, where there's a little bit of up and down there. Haley surged, as I said. Scott went down a little bit. DeSantis went down a little bit as well, and of course, people dropped out. Trump is still in the sort of low 40s, 42, 43%. 43 is what the number was in the latest Iowa poll. So his folks are pretty much locked in. It's just a question of how will the not Trump folks rearrange themselves, at least until somebody like, say, if it were to happen, if DeSantis drops out, a fairly large percentage of DeSantis supporters would actually go to Trump as their second choice, which seems a little interesting, but it shows that the two are sort of similar on a number of policy issues, even though it's a question of style and some other issues that separate them.
Now, we only have a couple of months here until the Iowa caucuses on January 15th. What are we going to see? We've got quite a few candidates still in the race. Donald Trump is obviously in and out of the courtroom. What are voters going to see here in Iowa?
No, besides snow, and hopefully there won't be snow on January 15th, or at least it'll be cleaned off by then. But this is where it gets to be crunch time. Usually around the holidays, there's a bit of a lull in the activities because obviously people don't want to campaign during Thanksgiving, and then later with Christmas and New Year's and other things going on, you sort of have this kind of slower period. Campaigns will still persevere. They'll be sending out their mailers, do certain things, show up at various events. There are going to be, again, meetings and things of that nature. Plus, the field staff will be doing their thing, showing up at county meetings and whatever else you have going on in the various counties. And so we'll still see some activity. But this is also then where we'll see especially once we get past the new year, and we've only got then 2 weeks until caucus night. That's when the big push will be on, more media attention. The various campaigns, as well as the county organizations, party organizations in the counties will be scrambling to make sure that their locations for the caucuses are locked down. The people that are supposedly running the precincts in terms of the precinct chair people, not just for the party, but for the individual campaigns, that they know what they're supposed to do. They know where they're supposed to go. They're telling their people. So things really will pick up in those last 2 weeks to make sure that everybody's on board.
Now, before I let you go, I do want to cross the aisle real quick to Joe Biden, who will not appear on the New Hampshire primary ballot. Can you explain that a little bit to our viewers and explain how it's going to impact him?
As far as the New Hampshire primary, that unlike Iowa, where the Democrats basically went along with the DNC's new proposal to kick Iowa out of the early states, the New Hampshire Democrats resisted. And they really didn't have too much of a choice because the Republicans controlled the process in New Hampshire, but still New Hampshire Democrats said, hey, we're first in the nation. We've been doing this for 100 years. We're going to keep on keeping on. Well, that meant that their primary is unsanctioned, which means that any candidate that gets into it gets penalized in some way or another. And also the delegates to New Hampshire will probably be cut in half or something of that nature. And so that's why Biden wouldn't want to be in the New Hampshire primary. So he didn't register. On the other hand, Dean Phillips, a Congress member, Democrat from Minnesota, said, I'm going to challenge Biden. He declared last week or so. And even though people think he's a long shot, again, it's often hard for a House member to run for presidency, especially challenging an incumbent. Still, it's somebody that seems to be a more serious candidate than even RFK Jr. And so Dean did register for the New Hampshire primary. And so it's technically unsanctioned. But all of a sudden, if you've got a Democrat that's on, a legitimate Democrat that's on the ballot, and if he were to win or even have a very close second place to Biden, and the Biden folks in New Hampshire are going to try to do a write-in campaign and hope that they can win that way, that it's still, if Dean Phillips does really well, it'll look bad for Biden. Of course, the Biden folks can simply say, well, hey, we weren't competing there, so it's not a big deal. On the other hand, it's still somebody else that's this kind of lesser known person, that it could be problematic for that person to do very, very well, if not actually win in that contest. And one of the things that it might also hurt Biden a little bit is if Dean Phillips starts to get some momentum even well before the New Hampshire primary. And New Hampshire actually hasn't set its date yet, but the assumption is it's going to be 8 days after the Iowa caucuses, so on January 23rd. And so if Dean Phillips starts to get some traction, and it looks like maybe he's going to be a little more successful than people expected, that might put a little bit of pressure on some of the other people who've been sniffing around about running for president, like California Governor Newsom or Michigan's Governor Whitmer, say it properly, that maybe they'll jump into the race, and then you'll have a bona fide race going on from there forward. Now, I think that's unlikely at this point, but still, it looks bad for Biden if Dean Phillips does well.
I've got to ask you before I let you go, too, is obviously we have a different situation going on this year with the Iowa Democrats holding their results until Super Tuesday. How do you think that's going to impact them?
Well, it's hard to say. I think that there are still some questions as far as how that process is going to go. The Iowa Democratic Party, the IDP, released some details of the process earlier in October, but there really weren't a lot of details to it. What we do know is that they're supposed to be beginning to accept applications, I guess you would call it, for having a vote to participate in the presidential preference portion beginning tomorrow on November 1st. So if that happens, how do they identify who's supposed to apply? How do you apply? Is there some notification? Are they just emailing or mailing something to all the Democrats in the state? It's just not clear how that's going to happen. Plus, they are accepting votes, requests for the votes until February 19th, which is very late in the process, and then have to announce again the results on September 5th, or excuse me, March 5th. So it's sort of an odd timeline. There are going to be problems with it. I still think there are logistical problems, but the bottom line is that even if everything else goes well and they get votes and they can announce results, but the fact that they're announcing it on Super Tuesday, Iowa's going to be lost in the process. That with not only the early states, the other early states going first, uh, including New Hampshire, which again is unsanctioned, but South Carolina and Nevada, maybe Michigan as well. So once all that happens, and then all the states that go on Super Tuesday, nobody's going to be paying much attention to what goes on in Iowa. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to continue to be first, simply because without that, we're just lost in the shuffle with all the other smaller states.
Well, Professor Hagle, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it, and I'm sure we will talk more once we get closer to the caucuses.
Good to be with you.